This Medical Minute is brought to you by First Choice Medical Group, featuring Dr. Anthony Lombardo, orthopedic surgeon with First Choice.
I'm Dr. Tony Lombardo from First Choice Medical Group. Today's topic is RICE, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. Why are these important? Because whenever you injure yourself, these are the first things you do. You rest the problem that you have, the part that's injured, you ice the problem that's injured, you compress it, and you elevate it above your heart. If these things do not help in relieving your pain and discomfort, then it's time to seek medical treatment. And that outside help may exist at your doctor's, could exist in an emergency room, it could exist in an urgent care center. That's the decision you need to make, but first, RICE, rest, ice, compression, and elevation.